My name is Barbara, and I am 75 years old. As a retired master electrician, I built a life of unwavering self-reliance in a field dominated by men, meticulously providing for my children, Stephen and Lisa, after their father's sudden passing when they were teenagers. I sacrificed countless personal opportunities, worked tirelessly in the most demanding conditions, ensuring they had a secure home and complete financial stability. I believed wholeheartedly in the inherent goodness of my family, in the unbreakable bond we had forged through years of struggle and mutual support. Every wire I connected, every circuit I completed, every dollar I earned was invested in their futures with absolute faith in their character and love. Then, after 2 severe strokes left me vulnerable and struggling with daily tasks, a debilitating fall in my own kitchen left me helpless on the cold linoleum floor for 36 agonizing hours. When paramedics finally found me, my children Stephen and Lisa, living 1,500 miles away in comfortable suburban lives, coldly feigned shock to the social services investigators. They blamed my stubborn independence, called me irrational and difficult, systematically denying any responsibility for my welfare. They abandoned me completely to the mercy of an overwhelmed system, refusing to provide help or even visit. My life savings, over $300,000, earned through decades of backbreaking work, was secretly drained from my accounts. My beloved home, the sanctuary I had built with my own hands, was put on the market without my knowledge or consent. My very humanity was utterly negated by their shocking indifference to my suffering. Yet, as Stephen callously declared to the social worker, this situation is entirely on her. Something deep within me awakened like electricity surging through a long dormant circuit. What they didn't know, what Michelle, his wife, didn't suspect, was my secret weapon detailed journals documenting every subtle plea for help I had made, every conversation where I had tried to reach out, and a small digital recorder that had captured their chilling indifference during our phone calls. My neighbor Eleanor had kept meticulous logs of their neglect recording dates and times when I had asked her to call them on my behalf. This time, their inhumane abandonment wouldn't just be quietly endured. I would reclaim my dignity fight for justice with the same determination that had carried me through 40 years in electrical work and find profound purpose as an advocate for forgotten elders, proving that resilience and truth could triumph over their shocking betrayal. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room felt nothing like the warm, incandescent bulbs I had installed in my own home over the years. As I lay there still weak from my fall and struggling to process what had happened to my life, Mr. Jenkins from Adult Protective Services entered with the kind of practiced efficiency that told me I was now just another case file in his overwhelming workload. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair beside my bed, "we need to discuss your situation. Your children have agreed to participate in this conversation by phone since they're unable to travel from California at this time." Unable to travel. The words hit me like a hammer blow. I had flown to California twice in the past 3 years, when Stephen's back surgery required help with his children and when Lisa's divorce proceedings needed emotional support. But now, when their mother lay broken and helpless, travel was suddenly impossible. Mr. Jenkins dialed the speakerphone with bureaucratic precision, and soon Stephen's voice filled the sterile room with a coldness that chilled me more than the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. "Hello, Mr. Jenkins," Stephen said with the polished professionalism he used in his corporate job. "Lisa and I appreciate you handling this situation. As we explained in our initial call, our mother has always been extremely independent sometimes to an unrealistic degree. Lisa's voice joined the conference, her tone carefully modulated to sound concerned while maintaining emotional distance. We've been worried about her living alone for years, but she's always insisted she could manage everything herself. We offered to visit multiple times, but she never seemed to have time in her schedule. The lie hit me like a physical blow. I had begged them to visit. I had specifically asked Stephen to come help me with some electrical repairs that were becoming too difficult for my aging hands. I had pleaded with Lisa to spend Christmas with me instead of going to her ex-husband's family gathering. Every invitation had been met with excuses about work, children's activities, or prior commitments. "We understand your mother's condition has deteriorated significantly," Mr. Jenkins said, consulting his notes. "Given her recent health episodes and this fall, we need to discuss long-term care options." That's when Michelle's voice joined the call, her participation uninvited but clearly orchestrated. "Mr. Jenkins, I need to be honest with you. Barbara has become increasingly difficult to deal with. She reaps what she sows, frankly. She's been so private and stubborn, and then expects miracles when things go wrong. We have our own busy lives to consider, our own children to raise." The casual cruelty of her words stunned me into silence. Michelle, who had never worked a day in the demanding physical labor that had supported her husband through college. Michelle, who had benefited from the financial stability my sacrifices had provided to Stephen's education and early career. I found my voice weak but determined. "Mr. Jenkins, please understand that I have always been self-reliant by necessity, not by choice. After my husband died, I had to be strong for my children. I raised them to be responsible, caring people. When they struggled financially in their early careers, I helped them without question. I offered Stephen $20,000 when his business was failing, and I paid for Lisa's children's school expenses when her divorce left her struggling. But Stephen's response was swift and cutting. Mom has always been fiercely independent to a fault. She never asked for help in any clear way, and frankly, she's been increasingly irrational lately. We offered to visit, but she never made time for us in her schedule. We're extremely busy with our own lives and responsibilities. This situation is entirely on her. We're simply not equipped to handle this level of care." The reversal of reality was so complete, so calculated, that I felt dizzy. They were rewriting history in real time, transforming my desperate pleas for connection into burdensome demands, my offers of help into signs of mental decline. Lisa's voice returned, reading what sounded like a prepared statement. "Mom never clearly told us she was struggling with daily activities. Why didn't she say anything specific? This is embarrassing for our family. People shouldn't expect us to drop everything and rearrange our lives. We have careers and children to think about." Michelle's final contribution was the cruelest cut of all. "Honestly, Mr. Jenkins, Barbara has clearly lost touch with reality. She reaps what she sows with this stubborn behavior. We cannot and will not be held responsible for her poor life choices." Mr. Jenkins, clearly influenced by their united, polished narrative, turned to me with the kind of patronizing sympathy reserved for difficult elderly patients. "Mrs. Patterson, given your children's assessment of the situation and their geographical limitations, Adult Protective Services will be recommending placement in a state-assigned care facility. Your current living situation is clearly unsuitable for someone with your health challenges." The words hit me like ice water. "My home. What about my home? Your children have indicated that your property will need to be sold to fund your care," Mr. Jenkins said matter-of-factly. "This is quite common in situations like yours." In that moment, I understood with crystal clarity that this wasn't about my health or safety. This was about money. My home, which I had wired myself, which I had maintained with my own hands for 30 years, was being sold to fund my imprisonment in a facility where I would be invisible, voiceless, and utterly dependent on strangers. Stephen's voice came through the speaker one final time, cold and final. "We'll handle the property arrangements, Mr. Jenkins. Our mother needs professional care that we're not qualified to provide. We appreciate your assistance in making this transition as smooth as possible." As the call ended and Mr. Jenkins gathered his papers, I lay in that hospital bed, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my entire life. These people who shared my blood, who I had sacrificed everything to raise and support, had just efficiently dismantled my entire existence in a 15-minute phone call. But underneath the devastation, something else was stirring. The same methodical determination that had carried me through decades of complex electrical work was beginning to focus on a new project. I would not disappear quietly into their convenient narrative. I had documentation evidence, and most importantly, the truth. They had made one crucial mistake in their calculated cruelty. They had underestimated the woman who had rewired entire buildings with nothing but skilled determination and absolute precision. 2 days after that devastating phone conference, the systematic destruction of my life began in earnest. Mr. Jenkins arrived with official paperwork that felt like reading my own death certificate. The documents, bearing legal seals and intimidating language, demanded that I sign over all remaining legal rights to my home and assets supposedly necessary for arranging my care. "This is standard procedure, Mrs. Patterson," Mr. Jenkins explained with bureaucratic indifference. "Your children have provided us with financial projections showing that the sale of your property will be required to cover long-term care costs." What he didn't mention, but what I discovered through my neighbor Eleanor's careful observations, was that Michelle had already been in contact with real estate agents, discussing not just the sale of my home, but the potential profit margins and her plans for the proceeds. Eleanor, bless her heart, had been keeping watch over my property since my hospitalization. During one of her daily walks past my house, she overheard Michelle on her cell phone, standing boldly in my own driveway, as if she already owned the place. The house should sell for at least $500,000. Michelle was saying, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "The neighborhood has really improved since Barbara bought it. We're thinking of using part of the proceeds for that kitchen remodel we've been planning, and Stephen wants to invest in expanding his business." Eleanor called me immediately at the hospital, her voice shaking with indignation. "Barbara, honey, I don't think they're planning to use that money for your care at all. They're already spending it in their minds." The revelation hit me like an electrical shock. My children weren't making difficult decisions about my care. They were liquidating my assets for their own benefit while using my health as convenient justification. That evening, alone in my sterile hospital room, I experienced the most devastating realization of my entire life. As I lay there, listening to the sounds of a hospital that never sleeps, memories came flooding back with painful clarity. After my husband's sudden death 35 years ago, our small electrical contracting business had faced complete financial ruin due to a massive hidden business debt of $200,000 that I discovered only after the funeral. I could have declared bankruptcy. I could have walked away and started over. Instead, I made a choice that would define the next decade of my life and steal my youth, my health, and my dreams. To protect Stephen and Lisa from the shame of financial ruin, to ensure Stephen could continue his engineering studies instead of dropping out to work, I secretly took on additional contracting jobs that pushed my body to its absolute limits. For 8 years, I worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week. I took every dangerous, difficult job that other electricians wouldn't touch. I crawled through filthy crawl spaces, worked in blazing attics during summer heat waves, and spent countless nights troubleshooting emergency repairs. I ate convenience store sandwiches for dinner and skipped medical checkups to save money. Every single dollar of that $200,000 debt was paid through my blood, sweat, and systematic destruction of my own physical health. My children never knew the extent of my sacrifice. They believed their father's life insurance had covered the business debts. They went on with their lives, Stephen graduating with honors, Lisa pursuing her teaching degree, both of them building successful careers on the foundation of my hidden suffering. Now, 3 decades later, as they casually planned to profit from my forced displacement, the irony was unbearable. The woman who had sacrificed her prime earning years to protect their futures was being discarded like a broken tool when she was no longer useful. The cruelest revelation came when I attempted to explain some of my past sacrifices to Mr. Jenkins, hoping he might understand the true character of our family dynamic. Through him, I sent a carefully worded message to Stephen and Lisa, subtly referencing how I had worked extra jobs after their father's death to ensure their financial security, and how I had always prioritized their needs over my own comfort. Stephen's response, delivered through Mr. Jenkins, was brutal in its dismissiveness. Our mother is always trying to make us feel guilty about her past choices. What she did or didn't do 30 years ago is her own business. She was a skilled electrician with good earning potential. She should have saved better for her retirement. We can't be held responsible for her financial planning failures. Lisa's contribution was equally devastating. She's just trying to control the narrative and manipulate us emotionally. She's been a burden for years, always hinting at sacrifices we never asked her to make. It's time for her to accept reality. But it was Michelle's public social media post that revealed the depth of their calculated cruelty. While I lay helpless in a hospital bed, she posted a photo of herself at an expensive restaurant with the caption, "Sometimes life requires difficult decisions. Some people just can't accept reality when it's time for major changes. Grateful for our peaceful, drama-free life." The post was clearly aimed at anyone who might question their handling of my situation, preemptively painting me as a difficult, unrealistic old woman who couldn't accept necessary changes. Meanwhile, the care plan they had arranged through Mr. Jenkins was nothing short of imprisonment disguised as assistance. I would be placed in Willow Creek Manor, a state-funded facility 2 hours away from anyone who knew me specializing in patients with cognitive decline and behavioral issues. The facility's visiting hours were severely restricted, and overnight stays by family members were prohibited. "Your children have explained that you tend to become agitated during family visits," Mr. Jenkins informed me. "The facility staff will monitor your interactions to ensure your emotional stability." The plan was clear and efficient. They would place me somewhere I couldn't cause them embarrassment or inconvenience, drain my assets to fund their own plans, and wait for time and isolation to solve their Barbara problem permanently. But they had made one crucial error in their calculations. They had forgotten that the woman they were discarding had spent 40 years solving complex problems under pressure, documenting every detail of her work, and never accepting defeat when lives and safety were at stake. I had kept meticulous records of every phone call, every request for help, every offer of assistance I had made to them over the years. My small digital recorder, originally purchased to document worksite conversations for liability purposes, had captured their cold dismissals and Michelle's cruel commentary during recent phone calls. Most importantly, Eleanor had been documenting their neglect with the precision of someone who understood that truth would eventually matter. She had dates, times, photographs, and even recordings of Michelle's callous phone conversations about selling my house. As I lay in that hospital bed, feeling the walls of my old life crumbling around me, I realized something that filled me with cold determination. They had underestimated not just my resourcefulness, but my willingness to fight for justice when everything else had been stripped away. The same methodical precision that had carried me through decades of electrical work was now focused on a new project, exposing their calculated cruelty and reclaiming my dignity no matter the cost. The morning of my discharge from the hospital arrived gray and cold, much like the future I was being forced to accept. I had spent 7 days in that sterile room waiting desperately for some sign that my children would reconsider their heartless plan. Instead, 2 uniformed transport technicians arrived with a wheelchair and official paperwork that sealed my fate. Mrs. Patterson, the younger technician, said with practiced kindness, "We're here to take you to your new residence at Willow Creek Manor. Your family has arranged everything for your comfort and safety." My family. The words felt like a cruel joke as I was helped into the wheelchair, still weak from my injuries and the emotional trauma of abandonment. Stephen and Lisa had not visited once during my hospital stay, not even to say goodbye to the woman who had given them life and sacrificed everything for their futures. As we loaded into the transport van, I caught sight of my beloved home one last time. There, standing in my own driveway, like conquering generals, surveying their spoils, were Stephen and Michelle. They weren't there to see me off or offer comfort. They were there to oversee the removal of my remaining personal belongings. I watched in helpless anguish as workers carried out my treasured possessions like they were disposing of unwanted furniture. My electrician's tools, collected over 4 decades of professional work, were loaded into a truck bound for storage. My journals, filled with decades of careful documentation of family memories and financial records, were deemed unsuitable for the facility and boxed away. Even my clothing was inspected and largely rejected, replaced with the standard issue garments provided by Willow Creek Manor. The symbolism was complete and devastating. They were erasing not just my presence, but my very identity as an independent, capable woman who had built a life through skill and determination. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, my dear neighbor, and the only person who truly understood what was happening, stood on her front porch, watching the systematic dismantling of my existence. Tears streamed down her weathered face as she witnessed this act of legalized robbery disguised as elder care. I tried desperately to call out to her, to wave, to make some connection with the one person who knew the truth about my character and my children's betrayal. But I was too weak, my voice too frail, to carry across the distance. Stephen and Michelle, noticing my attempt to communicate with Eleanor, deliberately positioned themselves between the van and her line of sight, blocking any possibility of farewell. In that moment, as the van pulled away from the only home I had ever truly owned, I felt something inside me die forever. The finality of their rejection was complete. I wasn't just losing my house. I was losing my identity, my community, my very existence as Barbara Patterson, master electrician, and devoted mother. Stephen's final communication came in the form of a cold, brief text message sent to Eleanor after we had driven away. "Mom is settled in appropriate care. Our family requires no further outside contact or interference. Thank you for your past consideration." The message was clear. Eleanor, my lifeline to the world I was being torn from, was being warned against any continued involvement in my life. They were severing every connection that might allow me to maintain my dignity or fight back against their systematic theft. Michelle's response to my exile was even more cruel in its public nature. Within hours of my departure, she posted photos on social media showing their simplified, peaceful life without the burden of caring for an elderly relative. The images showed expensive purchases clearly funded by the impending sale of my home, juxtaposed with inspirational quotes about letting go of toxic relationships and choosing happiness over obligation. Her message was unmistakable. I was the toxic burden they had finally freed themselves from, and my exile was cause for celebration rather than sorrow. At Willow Creek Manor, the final humiliation was completed with institutional efficiency. I was stripped of my own clothes and dressed in facility-issued garments that marked me as a ward of the state. My personal belongings were inspected and largely confiscated as potential safety hazards. Even my wedding ring was removed and placed in secure storage for my protection. Mr. Jenkins, having successfully closed another case file, visited once to ensure the transition was complete. His satisfaction with the tidy resolution was evident as he checked boxes on his forms and prepared to move on to the next family crisis requiring his intervention. Your children have handled this very responsibly, he told me with bureaucratic approval. They've ensured your inappropriate care while protecting your assets for your long-term needs. The lie was so complete, so thoroughly documented in official records, that my protestation seemed like the confused ramblings of a woman whose mental capacity was clearly diminished. In the desolate quiet of my shared room at Willow Creek Manor, surrounded by the sounds of institutional life and the smell of industrial disinfectant, I finally allowed myself to confront the deepest, most painful secret of my entire existence. 35 years ago, 2 years after my husband's death, I had been offered a chance at happiness that most people only dream of. David Chen, a successful electrical contractor from Oregon, had fallen deeply in love with me. He was kind, financially secure, and desperately wanted to build a new life together in a beautiful home he owned near the coast. David had proposed not just marriage, but a complete fresh start. He wanted to adopt Stephen and Lisa move us all to Oregon, where his expanding business offered opportunities for growth and prosperity. It was everything I had dreamed of during the darkest nights of widowhood and financial struggle. But Stephen, then a sensitive 17-year-old still grieving his father's death, had begged me through tears not to remarry. "Please don't leave Dad behind," he had pleaded. "Please don't replace him with someone else. I can't handle another big change. I need you to stay here with us, just us." Lisa, influenced by her older brother's distress, had echoed his pleas. "We don't need anyone else, Mom. We're a family just the way we are. Promise you won't leave us." Out of boundless maternal love and concern for their emotional stability, I had made the most devastating decision of my life. I told David I couldn't marry him, couldn't leave the life we had built, couldn't risk disrupting my children's sense of security during their vulnerable teenage years. David had left for Oregon, heartbroken, but understanding, sending letters for months, begging me to reconsider. I never responded, forcing myself to close the door on love, companionship, and financial security because I believed my children needed me to sacrifice my happiness for theirs. For 35 years, I had lived with the knowledge that I had chosen my children's perceived emotional needs over my own chance at love and partnership. I had convinced myself that this sacrifice was noble, necessary, and would someday be understood and appreciated. Now abandoned in this institutional prison by the very children I had sacrificed everything for, the irony was unbearable. Stephen, who had begged me not to leave him for another man, had discarded me without a second thought when I became inconvenient. The emotional security I had provided through my sacrifice had produced children capable of callous cruelty when my needs conflicted with their desires. The magnitude of what I had lost, love, companionship, financial security, a different life entirely, crashed over me like a tidal wave of regret and anguish. I had given up my one chance at happiness to protect children who had grown into adults capable of systematic betrayal. But in the depths of that devastating realization, something else emerged. The same electrical precision that had guided my professional life began to focus on a new circuit, a new connection that needed to be made. I would not disappear quietly into their convenient narrative. I had evidence, documentation, and most importantly, the truth about what real love and sacrifice looked like. They had abandoned me, but they had also freed me from any obligation to protect their comfort or reputation. The fight for my dignity and justice was about to begin, and this time I had nothing left to lose. Life at Willow Creek Manor was not care. It was a systematic regime of dehumanization that stripped away everything that made me human. Within days of my arrival, I discovered that this wasn't a place where elderly people received compassionate assistance. It was a warehouse where inconvenient family members were stored until death solved everyone's problems. My call light, that thin electronic lifeline to basic human dignity, was routinely ignored for hours at a time. I would lie in my narrow bed pressing the button with increasing desperation as pain from my hip fractures intensified beyond endurance. Sometimes I waited 4 hours for someone to respond, listening to staff conversations in the hallway about their weekend plans while I suffered in agony. When help finally arrived, it came with resentment and barely concealed irritation. "What do you need now, Mrs. Patterson?" became the standard greeting, delivered with the tone reserved for demanding children, rather than a woman who had spent 40 years solving complex problems under pressure. My pain medication, supposedly administered on a strict schedule, was consistently delayed or forgotten entirely. The excruciating suffering that resulted from missed doses was dismissed as normal aging discomfort that I needed to learn to manage. When I explained that I had worked through broken ribs and torn muscles during my electrical career, that I understood the difference between normal discomfort and medical neglect, the staff treated my protests as evidence of difficult behavior. The neglect extended to the most basic aspects of human dignity. My hygiene needs were attended to, sporadically leading to painful bed sores that made sitting or lying down agonizing. Meals arrived cold, unappetizing, and often hours late. The food was institutional slop that bore no resemblance to nutrition, served by staff who seemed genuinely annoyed that residents required nourishment. I overheard conversations between staff members that revealed the cruel reality of my situation. Another one whose family dumped her and never visits, one aide said to another while they thought I was sleeping. "These kids take the money and run. We're stuck dealing with the mess they leave behind." The casual cruelty of those words hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't a person with a complex history and legitimate needs. I was a burden that had been discarded and everyone knew it. But the systematic destruction of my identity was only beginning. 3 weeks after my arrival, Eleanor managed to call the facility and learn devastating news about my beloved home. Stephen and Lisa had not only sold my property for over $500,000, they had rented it out to tenants who were systematically destroying everything that represented my life's work. My electrical workshop, where I had built my business and maintained equipment for decades, was stripped bare. The carefully organized tool cabinets I had built with my own hands were thrown out as garage sale junk. My meticulously labeled parts boxes containing components I had collected over 40 years of professional work were dumped into garbage trucks like worthless debris. Michelle posted photos on social media of the renovated modern home, showing gleaming new surfaces where my workshop had once stood. Her captions celebrated the clean, updated space, with no mention of the master electrician's workshop that had been obliterated to create it. Every trace of my professional identity, my life's work, my legacy of skilled craftsmanship had been erased as if it had never existed. The photos were a deliberate assault on my memory and dignity. Michelle knew that people in our small community would see them, would understand that Barbara Patterson's life's work had been systematically destroyed by her own children. The message was clear. I had been not just abandoned, but completely erased. The cruelest blow came when Stephen and Michelle weaponized my own grandchildren against me in the most calculated way imaginable. Tom and Emily, now 15 and 12, were enrolled in a widely publicized seniors awareness campaign at their school in California designed to teach children about respecting and caring for elderly family members. During their presentation, which was covered by local media and shared extensively on social media, my grandchildren held up drawings of sad grandmas and spoke earnestly about the importance of caring for the elderly and making sure seniors feel loved and valued. The irony was devastating. They were being praised for their compassion while their own grandmother suffered in neglect 1,500 miles away. But the real cruelty came in their carefully scripted comments about their difficult situation with Grandma Barbara. Tom, reading from what was clearly a prepared statement, talked about how some grandparents become confused and need special care that families can't provide at home. Emily added that sometimes loving someone means making hard choices for their safety, even when they don't understand. They held up a photo of me looking disoriented and frail, clearly taken during my hospital stay and provided by Michelle. The image showed me at my most vulnerable moment, used now as evidence of my incapacity and their family's responsible decision-making. The local news coverage praised Stephen and Michelle for raising such compassionate, thoughtful children who understood the complexities of elder care. My grandchildren were portrayed as mature young people who had learned difficult lessons about love and sacrifice, while I was reduced to a cautionary tale about stubborn elderly people who refuse appropriate help. Watching this televised performance of pity from my facility bed, I felt something break inside me that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. These children I had loved unconditionally, whom I had hoped would remember their grandmother with affection, had been transformed into actors in their parents' elaborate justification for abandonment. The legal pressure intensified when Stephen and Lisa, through Mr. Jenkins, presented me with official documents designed to complete my financial destruction. The release of all claims paperwork would legally relinquish any rights I might have to the proceeds from my home's sale or any other family assets. Your children are concerned about your future care costs, Mr. Jenkins explained with bureaucratic efficiency. Signing this document will ensure that your assets are properly managed for your long-term needs. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable sign, away my rights voluntarily, or face the possibility that my already minimal care might be reduced even further. The stress of this legal manipulation, combined with the facility's systematic neglect, was causing my physical health to deteriorate rapidly. My hands developed a constant tremor that made writing difficult. My blood pressure spiked dangerously, requiring medication that left me foggy and disoriented. The combination of physical pain, emotional trauma, and institutional neglect was creating a downward spiral that made me appear increasingly fragile and confused to anyone who observed me superficially. But in my darkest moment, when I was considering whether fighting was worth the agony it brought, Eleanor Vance appeared like an angel of mercy. Despite the facility's restrictions on visitors and Stephen's instructions to limit my contact with the outside world, she had fought her way through bureaucratic obstacles to reach me. The sight of her familiar, caring face was like electricity flowing through dead circuits. She couldn't stay long, and she couldn't speak freely with staff monitoring our conversation, but she managed to slip something precious into my hand when the nurse stepped away. It was my old electrician's tape measure, worn smooth by decades of use, the one tool I had carried with me to every job site for 40 years. Eleanor had retrieved it from the debris when my workshop was destroyed, knowing instinctively that this tangible connection to my professional identity might be the lifeline I needed. Holding that familiar weight in my hands, feeling the smooth metal, and remembering the thousands of problems I had solved with its help, something fundamental shifted inside me. I was not just a discarded old woman dying in an institution. I was Barbara Patterson, master electrician, problem solver, and survivor of challenges that would have broken weaker people. The same methodical determination that had carried me through 4 decades of complex electrical work was still there, waiting to be activated. My children thought they had stripped me of everything that mattered, but they had forgotten the most important thing they had taught me, that when systems fail, you trace the problem to its source and fix it, no matter how complicated the wiring might be. The circuit was about to be completed, and this time I would be the one controlling the power. Despite the renewed determination that Eleanor's visit had sparked within me, the machinery of institutional indifference continued to grind forward with relentless efficiency. Mr. Jenkins returned to Willow Creek Manor with official paperwork that would seal my fate in ways I was only beginning to understand. "Mrs. Patterson," he announced, with the satisfaction of a man completing an unpleasant but necessary task. "After thorough evaluation of your case, Adult Protective Services has reached its official determination. You are hereby declared legally incapacitated and unable to make decisions regarding your personal care and finances." The words hit me like a physical blow. With a few signatures on official forms, I had been transformed from a competent adult who had managed complex electrical systems for decades into a ward of the state, no different from a child or someone with severe mental illness. "Your children will retain legal responsibility for your care decisions," Mr. Jenkins continued, "which validates their appropriate choice to place you in professional care facilities. This determination protects you from making harmful decisions due to your demonstrated inability to care for yourself safely." The circular logic was perfect and devastating. Because Stephen and Lisa had placed me in institutional care, I was deemed incapable of caring for myself. Because I was deemed incapable, their decision to abandon me was validated as responsible family management. My protests were now legally meaningless, the voice of someone whose judgment could not be trusted. But the humiliation was far from complete. Within a week of the incapacity determination, I learned that I was being transferred to an even more restrictive facility. Evergreen Asylum, despite its pleasant name, was known throughout the region as the place where families sent relatives with severe cognitive impairment and behavioral problems. "Your condition has deteriorated since your arrival," the head nurse explained as she supervised the packing of my few remaining possessions. "Evergreen specializes in patients who require more intensive supervision and behavioral management. The transfer itself was designed to strip away any remaining dignity I might have preserved." I was loaded into a medical transport van, like cargo sedated for the journey, to ensure patient compliance. The handful of personal items I had managed to keep, a few photographs, a small Bible, even the tape measure Eleanor had given me, were confiscated as inappropriate for the level of care required. These items could be used to harm yourself or others, a technician explained, as he sealed my belongings in a plastic bag marked with my case number. Evergreen will provide everything you need for your comfort and safety. As the van pulled away from Willow Creek Manor, I caught sight of people on the sidewalk watching my departure with the mixture of pity and relief that people show when someone else's tragedy confirms their own good fortune. I was becoming a cautionary tale, a visible reminder of what happened to elderly people who didn't plan properly for their decline. Meanwhile, Stephen and Lisa were orchestrating a sophisticated public relations campaign designed to cement their image as responsible, caring children forced to make difficult decisions. They issued a formal press release through a local news outlet announcing my placement in excellent, highly specialized long-term care and praising Adult Protective Services for their difficult but necessary intervention. We want to thank the professionals who helped us navigate this challenging situation, Stephen was quoted as saying. Our mother's fierce independence, while admirable throughout her career, became a serious safety concern as her health declined. We're grateful that she's now receiving the specialized care she needs. The press release included carefully selected photographs that told their version of my story. There was an old photo of me looking vibrant and competent, followed by recent images showing me looking frail and confused. The visual narrative was clear. This was a woman whose mental capacity had declined to the point where family intervention became necessary. Lisa contributed her own statement about the emotional difficulty of letting go and allowing professionals to provide care that the family couldn't safely offer at home. It breaks our hearts to see Mom this way. She was quoted as saying, "But we know we made the right choice for her safety and well-being." Lusty, the local newspaper ran a feature story about families dealing with elderly relatives who refuse appropriate care, using my situation as the primary example. The article portrayed Stephen and Lisa as model children who had overcome their mother's stubborn resistance to get her the help she needed. Michelle's social media posts during this period were masterpieces of calculated sympathy seeking. She shared inspirational quotes about loving someone enough to make hard choices and finding peace in difficult family decisions. Her posts generated hundreds of supportive comments from friends and acquaintances who praised the family's courage and wisdom. Mr. Jenkins, having successfully closed another case file, moved on to his next family crisis with the professional satisfaction of someone who had followed protocol correctly. During his final visit to document my transfer, he spoke about my situation with the detached satisfaction of a problem solved. Cases like this remind us why we have these systems in place, he told the Evergreen Intake Coordinator. Families need professional support when dealing with elderly relatives who can't accept their limitations. Mrs. Patterson's children should be commended for their persistence in getting her appropriate care. His words confirmed my worst fears about how my situation was being interpreted by the authorities I had hoped might help me. I wasn't a victim of abandonment and financial exploitation. I was a success story of family responsibility and professional intervention. But as the van carrying me to Evergreen Asylum pulled up to the facility's entrance, I caught sight of a familiar figure standing on the sidewalk across the street. Mrs. Eleanor Vance had somehow learned about my transfer and had come to witness this final stage of my institutional exile. Tears streamed down her weathered face as she watched me being wheeled into the building in restraints too sedated to acknowledge her presence, but still aware enough to see her anguish. In that brief moment, I understood that someone still believed in my worth as a human being, still recognized the injustice of what was happening to me. Eleanor's presence on that sidewalk was more than emotional support. It was evidence that not everyone had been convinced by Stephen and Lisa's carefully constructed narrative. Someone was still watching, still documenting, still caring about the truth of what was being done to Barbara Patterson. That single witness to my suffering became a flicker of hope in the institutional darkness I was entering. The system had embraced me with cold efficiency. My family had successfully convinced the world of their righteousness. But one person still knew the difference between compassionate care and calculated abandonment. As the doors of Evergreen Asylum closed behind me, I held on to the knowledge that Eleanor was out there fighting for justice in ways I couldn't yet imagine. The circuit wasn't complete, but the connection was still live, waiting for the right moment to carry power where it was needed most. Inside Evergreen Asylum, I discovered that the systematic destruction of my identity would be completed with clinical precision. This wasn't simply a care facility with inadequate resources. It was an institution designed to break down whatever remained of a person's sense of self-reducing complex human beings to manageable medical cases. My sharp intellect, honed by 4 decades of solving complex electrical problems, was now classified as a symptom requiring management. When I tried to engage staff members in conversations about practical problem solving or shared technical knowledge from my career, I was met with blank stares and dismissive responses. "We don't talk about work things here, dear," became the standard reply when I attempted to discuss electrical systems or engineering concepts. "You need to focus on relaxing and letting us take care of you." The infantilizing tone was deliberate and devastating. My professional expertise, which had earned me respect and financial independence for decades, was now treated as evidence of agitation or confusion. When I pointed out that the facility's electrical outlets were installed incorrectly and posed safety hazards, I was told that obsessive thoughts about technical matters were common among residents with declining cognitive function. There were no books in my room, no puzzles or mental challenges, no opportunities for meaningful conversation or intellectual engagement. The television was permanently tuned to mindless programming designed for people with severe dementia. My requests for reading material about electrical engineering or technical journals were dismissed as inappropriate for your current level of care. The message was clear: Barbara Patterson, master electrician and problem solver, no longer existed. In her place was a confused elderly woman whose attempts to engage her mind were symptoms to be managed rather than human needs to be met. The physical neglect was even more systematic and cruel than what I had experienced at Willow Creek Manor. Despite the facility's high cost, funded entirely by the proceeds from my stolen home, the actual care provided was minimal and depersonalized. My pain medication for hip and shoulder fractures was consistently delayed or skipped entirely, supposedly due to scheduling conflicts or concerns about dependency. The resulting agony was excruciating and prolonged, leaving me writhing in bed for hours, while staff members walked past my room without acknowledging my suffering. When I cried out for help with basic needs, like assistance, getting to the bathroom, or being repositioned to relieve pressure sores, my calls were routinely ignored for hours. The humiliating accidents that resulted from this neglect were treated as evidence of my declining condition rather than consequences of inadequate care. I lost significant weight as meals became increasingly irregular and unappetizing. My skin developed a sallow, unhealthy appearance that made me look far older and more frail than my 75 years. The woman who had once climbed ladders and crawled through tight spaces to complete complex installations was now struggling to sit up in bed without assistance. The emotional starvation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of my imprisonment. Stephen and Lisa's visits became completely non-existent with their phone calls routed through staff members who faithfully delivered messages that I was resting or not up to talking whenever they called. The few communications I received from my children were generic greeting cards with impersonal messages that could have been sent to any elderly stranger. "Hope you're feeling well," and "thinking of you" replaced any acknowledgement of our shared history or their role in my current situation. Worse than the absence of contact was the nature of what little they did send. The care packages that arrived occasionally contained childish puzzles designed for people with severe cognitive impairment, coloring books with large simple pictures and other items that emphasized their view of me as mentally incompetent. Each package was a deliberate insult to my intelligence and professional accomplishments, a reminder that they had successfully reduced me from master electrician to confused elderly woman in the eyes of everyone who mattered. But Michelle's calculated cruelty reached new heights when she sent a photograph to the facility that was specifically designed to torture me psychologically. The image showed a newly installed smart home automation system in Stephen's house, complete with voice-controlled lighting, automated climate systems, and wireless security features. Her accompanying note, which was read to me by a staff member who seemed to enjoy my distress, said, "Stephen is so talented with all this modern technology. No old-fashioned wiring needed here. Everything is wireless and automated. It's amazing how much easier life is with current systems." The deliberate mockery of my life's work was breathtaking in its cruelty. She was using my own son's modest technical abilities I had nurtured and encouraged, to ridicule the electrical expertise that had supported their family for decades. The smart home system they were celebrating was made possible by the fundamental electrical infrastructure I had spent my career installing and maintaining. Meanwhile, Eleanor's desperate attempts to maintain contact with me were systematically blocked by facility policies that Stephen and Lisa had specifically requested. She called repeatedly, only to be told that I was unwell or unable to take calls due to my deteriorating condition. When she attempted to visit, she was informed that I had been placed on a restricted visitor list due to family concerns about overstimulation and medical recommendations for minimal external contact. Eleanor's frustrated attempts to reach me were documented by staff as evidence of disruptive outside influences that needed to be managed for my well-being. The isolation was so complete that I began to question my own memories and perceptions. When every authority figure in my life confirmed that I was confused, declining, and incapable of accurate judgment, it became increasingly difficult to maintain confidence in my version of events. But in my deepest moment of despair, when I was beginning to wonder if Stephen and Lisa might be right about my mental decline, something unexpected happened that reminded me of who I really was. A new staff member, a young woman named Sarah, who had recently started working at Evergreen, quietly left a discarded trade magazine on my bedside table. The publication was 6 months old and had been found in the staff break room, but the cover article was about enduring principles of electrical circuit design. Sarah didn't say anything about the magazine, but her small act of recognition, seeing me as someone who might be interested in technical information rather than just another confused resident, was like a spark jumping across a gap in a damaged circuit. Reading about electrical theory and modern applications reminded me that my knowledge was real valuable and still relevant. The principles I had mastered over 4 decades hadn't become obsolete just because I was now confined to an institutional bed. My mind was still capable of understanding complex systems and solving problems despite everyone's insistence that I was mentally incompetent. That magazine became my lifeline to sanity and hope. It reminded me that I was still Barbara Patterson, Master Electrician, and that my current situation was not the result of my failures, but of other people's systematic betrayal and cruelty. The same methodical approach that had guided my professional career began to focus on my current predicament with renewed clarity. This wasn't a care facility. It was a prison designed to break my spirit and validate my children's abandonment. But like any complex system, it had vulnerabilities that could be identified and exploited by someone with the right knowledge and determination. The circuit wasn't broken. It was just waiting for the right connection to restore power where it belonged. Despite my renewed determination to fight back against the systematic destruction of my life, every attempt to communicate the truth about my situation was met with increasingly sophisticated efforts to silence me. The institutional machinery that had been designed to protect me had become the perfect weapon for my children to ensure that my voice would never be heard. My efforts to document the neglect and abandonment I was experiencing began with handwritten letters that I painstakingly composed during the brief periods when pain medication allowed me to think clearly. I wrote to Eleanor, detailing the missed medications, the ignored calls for help, and the deliberate isolation from family contact. I wrote to my former clients, hoping they might remember the competent, reliable electrician I had been, and question the narrative of mental decline being spread about me. Most importantly, I wrote directly to Mr. Jenkins at Adult Protective Services, providing specific dates and times when my care had been inadequate, citing examples of my children's abandonment, and pleading for a genuine investigation of my situation rather than the rubber stamp approval of Stephen and Lisa's manufactured story. But every letter I attempted to send disappeared into the institutional black hole of mail monitoring. Staff members explained that all outgoing correspondence from residents required review to ensure appropriate content and emotional stability. My carefully documented accounts of neglect were dismissed as paranoid accusations and attention-seeking behavior that reflected my deteriorating mental state. The few letters that I was told had been sent never received responses, leading me to suspect they had never actually been mailed at all. When I asked to use the facility telephone to follow up on my correspondence, I was told the phone was broken, or that I would need to wait days for my turn, or that my phone privileges had been suspended due to agitated behavior. The small digital recorder that Eleanor had managed to smuggle to me during her last visit, disguised inside a box of tissues, mysteriously disappeared during a routine room cleaning. When I asked about it, staff members looked at me with blank expressions and suggested that I might be confused about what belongings I actually had. Eleanor, growing increasingly desperate about my situation, filed a formal complaint with Adult Protective Services about the quality of care I was receiving and the suspicious circumstances surrounding my children's management of my assets. She provided detailed documentation of her observations, including the rapid sale of my home, the destruction of my workshop, and the systematic isolation from community members who had known me for decades. Stephen and Lisa's response to Eleanor's complaint was swift and devastating. They contacted both the facility and Adult Protective Services with a formal letter expressing deep concern about outside interference with my care. They portrayed Eleanor as a well-meaning but misguided neighbor whose emotional attachment to me was preventing her from accepting the reality of my condition. Mrs. Vance has been unable to accept that our mother's cognitive abilities have declined significantly, Stephen wrote in his letter. Her continued attempts to contact our mother and interfere with professional medical decisions are causing distress and agitation that interfere with treatment. We request that Mrs. Vance's access to our mother be restricted for everyone's well-being. The letter included selective quotes from my medical records at Evergreen describing my paranoid accusations against family members and my inability to accept appropriate care. They painted Eleanor's advocacy as the meddling of someone who couldn't face the truth about my mental decline. But Michelle's response was even more calculated and cruel. She took Eleanor's complaint and Stephen's response letter and created a public narrative designed to destroy my credibility permanently. She contacted a prominent gossip blog that specialized in family drama stories, providing them with a carefully crafted version of events that portrayed me as a difficult, ungrateful mother whose children were heroically managing her decline. The blog post, which was shared thousands of times on social media, described me as a paranoid elderly woman whose delusions of mistreatment were being encouraged by a misguided neighbor who couldn't accept reality. Michelle provided quotes from my supposed medical records about my aggressive behavior and inability to cooperate with caregivers. The story painted Stephen and Lisa as long-suffering children dealing with a mother who had become increasingly difficult and unreasonable as her mental health deteriorated. Michelle positioned herself as the rational daughter-in-law, trying to protect the family from my manipulative behavior and false accusations. The public response to the blog post was overwhelmingly supportive of my children. Hundreds of comments praised them for their patience and dedication in dealing with such a challenging situation. I was held up as an example of how elderly people can become demanding and ungrateful, making life difficult for family members who are trying their best to help. When Mr. Jenkins made his follow-up visit to Evergreen Asylum to investigate Eleanor's complaint, he arrived with preconceived notions shaped by Stephen and Lisa's sophisticated narrative. He reviewed the facility's care logs, which had been carefully sanitized to show adequate attention to my needs, and spoke with staff members who had been coached to describe me as uncooperative and prone to making unfounded accusations. Mrs. Patterson, he said during our brief interview, I've received some concerning reports about your behavior here. Making false accusations against your family and the care staff isn't helping your situation. Your children are doing everything possible to ensure you receive appropriate care, and you need to cooperate with the professionals who are trying to help you. His words confirmed my worst fears about how my situation was being interpreted. Every attempt I made to advocate for myself was being used as evidence of my mental instability. The system that was supposed to protect vulnerable elderly people had been turned into a weapon against me by my own children. The final violation came when Michelle managed to obtain my personal journals through her connections at the facility. These private writings, which I had kept for decades to document my work and thoughts, contained my most intimate reflections on family relationships, financial sacrifices, and personal struggles. Michelle selectively edited excerpts from these journals, taking phrases completely out of context to create evidence of my supposed mental instability and vindictive nature. She created a video montage that spliced together emotional passages from my darkest moments adding ominous background music and her own commentary about my manipulative martyrdom and delusional victimhood. The video, which went viral on multiple social media platforms, portrayed me as a conniving old woman who had spent years plotting against her loving children and creating false narratives of sacrifice and abandonment. Michelle's narration painted my journal entries as proof of my mental decline and dangerous obsession with imagined grievances. Watching fragments of my most private thoughts being twisted into weapons against me was a violation that felt like spiritual rape. The woman who had once been respected for her integrity and reliability was now a public laughingstock, held up as an example of how mental illness could turn elderly people into dangerous liars. But in the depths of this systematic character assassination, an unexpected witness was quietly documenting the truth. Sarah, the young nurse, who had given me the electrical engineering magazine, had been disturbed by the viral video and the family's behavior during their rare visits to the facility. Sarah had begun keeping her own detailed notes about my care, my lucid conversations about technical subjects, and my children's explicit instructions to the staff about minimizing my access to communication and visitors. She recognized the difference between a confused elderly woman and someone whose voice was being systematically silenced. Her careful documentation would eventually become crucial evidence, but for now, I remained trapped in an institutional prison where my every word was used against me, and my truth was transformed into proof of my deception. The circuit of my voice had been deliberately severed, but somewhere in the darkness, connections were still being made that would eventually restore power to where it belonged. Against all odds and the institutional machinery designed to silence me forever, Eleanor's unwavering determination had accomplished something I thought impossible. Working with a legal aid attorney who specialized in elder abuse cases and a retired adult protective services supervisor who had become disturbed by the corruption in the system, she had compelled APS to conduct a full, independent review of my case. The hearing was scheduled to take place in the county courthouse, and somehow word had spread through social media about the Barbara Patterson case. The elderly woman whose children's viral campaign had painted her as mentally unstable while they profited from her assets. The national attention Michelle had sought to destroy my credibility had backfired, drawing scrutiny from investigative journalists and elder rights advocates who suspected there was more to the story. As I was wheeled into the hearing room, still physically frail, but dressed in clothes that Eleanor had brought from my old wardrobe, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: dignity. The woman in those familiar clothes was Barbara Patterson, master electrician and survivor, not just another confused nursing home resident. The room was packed with reporters, legal observers, and members of elder advocacy groups who had rallied around cases like mine. Stephen and Lisa sat at a table with their attorney, their faces masks of barely controlled panic. Michelle was noticeably absent. I learned later that she had fled to her mother's house in another state when the investigation was announced. Mr. Jenkins sat in the front row, looking deeply uncomfortable as he waited to account for his role in validating my children's narrative without proper investigation. This was no longer a routine case closure for him. It had become a public examination of how the system could fail vulnerable elderly people so completely. Eleanor took her place at the witness table with the quiet determination of someone who had fought bureaucrats and uncaring institutions her entire life. In her hands was a small device that would change everything my old digital recorder disguised to look like a vintage radio which she had retrieved from my home during the forced eviction. Your Honor, Eleanor's attorney began, We have audio evidence that will demonstrate conclusively that Mrs. Patterson's children systematically abandoned her while creating a false narrative to justify their financial exploitation. When Eleanor pressed play on the recorder, Stephen's voice filled the courtroom with startling clarity. The first recording was from 6 months before my fall, when I had called him for help with some electrical repairs that were becoming too difficult for my aging hands. "Mom, you're exaggerating the problem," Stephen's voice said with dismissive irritation. "You managed fine for 40 years. I'm sure you can figure it out. We're really busy with the kids' activities right now." The second recording captured Lisa's response when I had asked if they could visit for Christmas instead of going to her ex-husband's family gathering. "Mom, we already made plans. You know how complicated our situation is with the divorce. Maybe next year if we can fit it in our schedule." But the most devastating recording was from the period just after my strokes, when I had explicitly asked for help with grocery shopping and managing my medications. "This is on you, Mom," Stephen's voice declared with chilling indifference. "You chose to live alone this far away from us. We have our own lives and responsibilities. We can't drop everything because you're having problems managing your life." The raw callousness in their voices, the explicit dismissal of my needs, the complete lack of warmth or concern. It all contrasted sharply with the loving, concerned children they had portrayed themselves as in public statements. The recordings revealed the truth that no amount of public relations manipulation could disguise. Mr. Jenkins's face visibly changed as he listened to the evidence. The detached professionalism that had characterized his earlier interactions with me gave way to shock, then mounting concern, and finally what appeared to be genuine horror at his own role in enabling this abuse. When the recordings ended, the courtroom was silent, except for the sound of several people quietly crying. Mr. Jenkins stood up slowly, his voice shaking with emotion as he addressed me directly. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, "I owe you a profound and public apology. I allowed myself to be manipulated by your children's sophisticated presentation while dismissing your legitimate concerns as confusion. I failed in my most basic duty to protect a vulnerable elder, and I will spend the remainder of my career working to ensure this never happens to anyone else." His admission sent shockwaves through the room. Here was a government official acknowledging systemic failure and taking personal responsibility for his role in my suffering. But the most dramatic moment came when Stephen was called to testify. As he walked to the witness stand, I could see the psychological toll that months of maintaining his elaborate deception had taken. His confident businessman's demeanor had cracked, replaced by the trembling uncertainty of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. The attorney's questions were direct and unforgiving. "Mr. Patterson, do you recognize your voice on these recordings?" "Yes," Stephen whispered. "When your mother explicitly asked for help with basic needs, why did you refuse?" Stephen's composure began to crumble visibly. His breathing became rapid and shallow as the weight of his own recorded words crashed down on him. "When she fell and lay on her floor for 36 hours, where were you?" We have our own." "When you sold her home for $500,000, how much of that money went to her care?" Stephen's psychological defenses finally shattered completely. He began hyperventilating, then collapsed into uncontrollable sobbing that filled the courtroom with the sound of a man's soul breaking apart. "She's right," he screamed through his tears. "It was always us. We left her to rot because we wanted the money. We let her suffer because it was easier than helping. I'm a monster. I abandoned my own mother." His public breakdown was devastating to witness. This was the child I had sacrificed my chance at love to protect the son whose emotional security had been more important to me than my own happiness. Seeing him destroyed by the consequences of his own cruelty brought me no satisfaction, only profound sadness for what we had both lost. Lisa and Michelle, who had been sitting in the gallery, were visibly shaken by Stephen's confession. Michelle avoided all eye contact, her carefully constructed public image crumbling as the recordings exposed her calculated participation in my destruction. Lisa hung her head in profound shame, tears streaming silently down her face as she finally confronted the truth of what they had done to me. When Lisa caught my eye across the courtroom, I saw something that gave me the first glimmer of hope I had felt in months. It wasn't the manipulative remorse she had shown before. It was genuine, devastating recognition of the depth of her betrayal and the beginning of what might someday become real redemption. The truth was finally public documented and undeniable. But as I sat in that courtroom watching my family's complete destruction, I realized that vindication came with its own form of grief. Justice had been served, but the cost to everyone involved was immeasurable. The APS ruling came swiftly and decisively, marking the end of my children's ability to control my life and the beginning of their accountability for what they had done. Based on the overwhelming evidence from the voice recordings, Eleanor's meticulous documentation, and my own testimony about the systematic neglect I had endured, the panel found Stephen and Lisa guilty of criminal elder neglect and abandonment. The legal consequences were severe and immediate. Stephen and Lisa were mandated to assume full financial responsibility for my care, including reimbursement for all medical expenses I had incurred due to their neglect and the restoration of the funds they had stolen from my home's sale. They were required to ensure my placement in a high-quality care facility of my choosing, or to provide comprehensive in-home care if I preferred to live independently. More importantly, for my sense of justice, they faced severe public sanctions and the possibility of criminal charges that could result in prison time. The state had finally acknowledged that what they had done to me was not just morally wrong, it was criminally negligent. But the impact of my case extended far beyond our family's private tragedy. The investigation had revealed systematic problems within the elder care industry that demanded immediate attention. Sarah, the compassionate nurse, who had documented the truth about my treatment at Evergreen Asylum, had connected with other healthcare workers who had witnessed similar abuses. Their combined testimony, amplified by investigative journalists who had begun following my story, led to a major national expose of the widespread neglect occurring in facilities like Willow Creek Manor and Evergreen Asylum. The investigation revealed patterns of inadequate care, financial exploitation, and systematic silencing of residents' complaints that affected thousands of elderly people across the state. Other families began coming forward with their own stories of relatives who had been warehoused in these facilities and forgotten. The stories were heartbreakingly similar to mine elderly people with assets who were declared incompetent by children eager to gain control of their finances, then placed in expensive facilities that provided minimal actual care while draining their life savings. Within 6 months of my hearing, both Willow Creek Manor and Evergreen Asylum faced criminal investigations, multiple lawsuits, and ultimately permanent closure. They became national cautionary tales about the dangers of an unregulated elder care industry, more concerned with profit than human dignity. The personal consequences for my children were severe and long-lasting. Stephen, already psychologically shattered by his public breakdown, was sentenced to 18 months in a minimum security facility for elder abuse and financial exploitation. His business collapsed under the weight of negative publicity, and his marriage to Michelle disintegrated as she abandoned him to save her own reputation. From his cell, Stephen sent me a letter that revealed the true depths of his psychological collapse. His handwriting was shaky, his thoughts disjointed as he tried to process the magnitude of what he had done. "Mom," he wrote, "I wake up every morning knowing that I am the worst kind of person, someone who destroyed the woman who gave him life. I can't explain how I became so callous, so greedy, so willing to sacrifice your dignity for my comfort. I don't expect forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I just need you to know that I understand now what I stole from you, and I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life." His letter brought me profound sadness rather than satisfaction. This broken man was still my child, and seeing him destroyed by the consequences of his own choices gave me no joy. I felt compassion for his suffering, even as I recognized that our relationship could never be fully repaired. Michelle's downfall was swift and complete. When Stephen's legal troubles became public, she fled to another state, leaving behind the comfortable suburban life she had built on my stolen assets. Her social media accounts, once filled with inspirational quotes and photos of her privileged lifestyle, were deleted as she tried to escape the public consequences of her cruelty. The community that had once admired her as a devoted wife and mother now saw her as a calculating woman who had profited from elderly abuse. Her attempts to rebuild her life elsewhere were hampered by the viral nature of the story and her easily recognizable face from the news coverage. But Lisa's response to the judgment gave me hope for healing I had thought was impossible. Unlike Stephen's psychological collapse or Michelle's cowardly flight, Lisa faced the consequences of her actions with genuine remorse and a determination to make amends. 3 days after the ruling, she came to see me alone, without lawyers or prepared statements. The woman who sat beside my bed was not the manipulative daughter who had participated in my destruction, but someone who had been fundamentally changed by confronting the truth of what she had done. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking with emotion, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to understand that I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to earn it. I was a coward who let Stephen and Michelle convince me that abandoning you was somehow merciful. I was weak and selfish, and I participated in destroying the woman who sacrificed everything for me." Over the following months, Lisa's transformation was remarkable and sustained. She enrolled in therapy to understand how she had become capable of such cruelty. She took a leave of absence from her job to become my primary advocate and caregiver. Most importantly, she began the difficult work of rebuilding trust through consistent loving actions rather than empty words. Lisa's children, now teenagers, who had been kept away from me during the worst period of my institutionalization, were gradually reintroduced to their grandmother. They had been told I was mentally ill and dangerous, but as they got to know me again, they began to understand the truth about what had happened to our family. My grandson Tom, now 16, was particularly affected by learning about his family's cruelty. "Grandma," he said during one of our conversations, "I'm ashamed that I believed them when they said you were crazy. You're the strongest, smartest person I know, and I want to learn from you about how to be better than they were." For me, the vindication was complete but bittersweet. My truth had been acknowledged, my dignity restored, and my stolen assets returned. The facilities that had tortured me were closed, and other elderly people would be protected from similar abuse. Justice had been served in ways I had barely dared to hope for. but the victory came with permanent losses that no amount of legal satisfaction could repair. Stephen was broken beyond repair, his life destroyed by his own choices. Michelle had revealed herself to be utterly without redeeming qualities. Most painfully, the years of suffering and the trust that had been shattered could never be fully restored. Yet in the midst of that complex mixture of triumph and grief, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my husband's death, a sense of purpose that extended beyond my own survival. My story had become a catalyst for protecting other vulnerable elderly people, and my suffering had been transformed into a powerful force for systemic change. The fight had been agonizing, but it had also liberated me in ways I was only beginning to understand. 2 years after the hearing that changed everything, I stood in the kitchen of my new home, a beautiful cottage in an independent living community that I had chosen for myself. The morning sunlight streamed through windows that I controlled, illuminating walls decorated with photographs that told the true story of my life. Pictures of electrical projects I had completed, community work I had done, and the family relationships that were now being rebuilt on foundations of honesty and respect. The contrast between this peaceful morning routine and the institutional nightmare I had endured was profound. Every choice in my day was mine to make: when to wake up, what to eat, who to call, where to go. The autonomy that Stephen and Lisa had stolen from me had been not just restored, but enhanced by the legal protections now in place to prevent future abuse. My health had improved dramatically once I received proper medical care and emotional support. The tremors that had made me appear frail and confused were revealed to be side effects of the inappropriate medications I had been given at the facilities. My mind, no longer clouded by drugs or depression, was as sharp as it had ever been. I was once again the competent, intelligent woman who had built a successful electrical contracting business through skill and determination. Lisa had become not just my daughter again, but my closest friend and strongest advocate. Her commitment to making amends was unwavering and had earned my forgiveness through consistent loving actions over time. She visited regularly, and our conversations were marked by the kind of honesty that had been missing from our relationship for decades. "Mom," she said during one of our Sunday afternoon visits, "getting to know you again, the real you, not the version Stephen and Michelle tried to create, has been the greatest gift of my life. I'm ashamed it took a legal judgment for me to see what an extraordinary woman you are, but I'm grateful every day that I get to be part of your life now." Her children, my grandchildren, had become a source of joy I had never thought I would experience again. Tom, now 18 and preparing for college, often came to me for advice about his future plans. His respect for my professional achievements and personal resilience had grown as he learned the truth about our family's history. "Grandma," he told me proudly, "I've decided to study social work with a focus on elder advocacy. What happened to you taught me that there are systems that fail people, but there are also ways to fight back and make things better. I want to help other families avoid what we went through." Emily, now 15, had developed a passion for electrical engineering that reminded me of my younger self. She spent hours with me learning about circuits and problem solving, approaching technical challenges with the same systematic thinking I had used throughout my career. "The real story of our family is so much more interesting than the fake version," she observed as we worked on a rewiring project together. "You're a hero, Grandma, not a victim. You fought back against people who tried to erase you, and you won." Stephen remained a distant, tragic figure in our restored family. He had been released from prison after serving 14 months, but his attempts to rebuild his life were hampered by the public nature of his crimes and the psychological damage from his breakdown. His occasional letters showed a man struggling with depression and genuine remorse, but also someone who might never fully recover from the consequences of his choices. "I don't expect to ever have a normal relationship with you again," he wrote in his most recent letter. "But I want you to know that seeing your strength and dignity throughout this ordeal has taught me what real courage looks like. I'm proud to be your son, even though I know I'll never deserve that relationship again." I read his letters with sadness, but without bitterness. Some betrayals are too fundamental to be fully forgiven, and some relationships cannot be repaired. But I had found peace with that reality rather than anger. Michelle had disappeared entirely from our lives, trying to rebuild her identity in another state where her role in my abuse was less well known. I occasionally heard updates about her struggles to find work and rebuild her reputation, but I felt only indifference toward her fate. She had revealed herself to be someone fundamentally without empathy or conscience, and her absence was a blessing rather than a loss. My work as an elder advocate had become my greatest source of purpose and fulfillment. The combination of my personal experience with abuse and my professional background in systematic problem solving gave me unique credibility in the field of elder rights and institutional reform. My memoir, Disconnected: An Electrician's Fight for Dignity in the Age of Elder Abuse, had been published to critical acclaim and had become a resource for families, legal advocates, and policymakers working to prevent similar tragedies. The book tour had taken me across the country, speaking to audiences who understood the courage required to fight back against systematic dehumanization. "The most important thing I learned," I told one audience in Detroit, "is that dignity is not something that can be taken from you by others. It's something you maintain by refusing to accept their definition of your worth." They tried to erase Barbara Patterson, master electrician, and replace her with a confused old woman. But I knew who I really was, and I never stopped fighting to prove it. My work with Sarah the nurse, who had documented the truth about my treatment, had evolved into a nonprofit organization that provided resources and advocacy for elderly people facing institutional abuse. We had helped dozens of families navigate complex legal and medical systems, and our work had contributed to legislative changes that strengthened protections for nursing home residents. The community of advocates and survivors had become my chosen family in many ways. These were people who understood the importance of fighting for basic human dignity, who appreciated the complex work required to expose systematic abuse and create meaningful change. Standing in my kitchen that morning, preparing coffee for Lisa's visit, and reviewing notes for an upcoming conference presentation, I felt a profound sense of completion. The journey from abandoned elderly woman to respected advocate had been agonizing, but it had also been transformative in ways I could never have anticipated. I had learned that authentic happiness wasn't about avoiding difficult truths or maintaining comfortable relationships at any cost. It was about having the courage to demand dignity and respect, to build relationships on honesty rather than convenience, and to find purpose in transforming personal pain into help for others. My life had been reclaimed not through forgiveness or reconciliation, but through the simple act of refusing to disappear quietly. The same electrical principles that had guided my professional career, tracing problems to their source, making proper connections, restoring power where it belonged, had ultimately saved not just my own life, but had created pathways for others to find their own justice and healing. As I sit in my garden this evening, 5 years after the hearing that restored my life, I am filled with a peace that goes deeper than mere contentment. The roses I planted when I first moved to this cottage are blooming magnificently, their beauty unforced and authentic, much like the life I have built from the ashes of betrayal and systematic cruelty. My home is frequently filled with the sounds of genuine family life. Lisa's laughter, my grandchildren's excited voices, sharing their achievements and dreams, friends from my advocacy work stopping by to plan our next project. These relationships, rebuilt on foundations of truth rather than convenient fiction, are deeper and more meaningful than anything we shared during the years of careful avoidance and protective lies. The work I do now brings me profound fulfillment that extends far beyond personal satisfaction. My advocacy organization has helped prevent dozens of cases similar to mine, and the legislative changes we've achieved will protect vulnerable elderly people for generations to come. The letters I receive from families who have found strength in my story remind me daily that my painful journey has created pathways for others to reclaim their own dignity and voice. I have learned that my greatest strength was never in silent endurance or blind trust in family loyalty, but in my willingness to fight for my own worth when everyone else had written me off. Self-respect, I discovered, is an unshakable foundation that cannot be destroyed by others' cruelty or indifference. True family is built on mutual respect and genuine care, not just shared blood or legal obligations. The universal truth that emerged from my struggle resonates far beyond elder abuse. Systematic cruelty can only succeed when victims are silenced and isolated. But when one person refuses to disappear quietly, when truth is documented and witnessed, even the most sophisticated campaigns of dehumanization can be exposed and defeated. It takes extraordinary courage to fight for your authentic identity against those who profit from your silence. But that courage is always rewarded with the incomparable gift of living genuinely. Dignity can be reclaimed even after the most profound betrayal. A life of purpose and authentic connection is always possible when we choose truth over comfort, justice over peace, and self-respect over the approval of those who would diminish us. The resilience of the human spirit can triumph over even the most calculated cruelty, transforming our deepest suffering into our greatest source of strength and service to others. I carry no bitterness now, only profound wisdom gained from understanding that some people will always choose convenience over conscience. But I also know that truth, like electricity, will always find a way to complete its circuit and restore power where it belongs.